What if the most transformative period in human history wasn't marked by the rise of cities or the invention of writing, but by something far more primal? A time when ice ruled the world and our ancestors walked through landscapes that would seem alien to us today? What if everything we think we know about human evolution, about the stories our species tells itself, about the very foundations of civilization, all traces back to those frozen millennia when survival meant more than just finding food and shelter? It meant becoming something entirely new. The Ice Age wasn't just a chapter in Earth's climate history. It was the crucible that forged humanity itself, a period so profound and mysterious that its echoes still whisper through our myths, our dreams, and perhaps even our DNA. Tonight, as the world grows quiet around you, let's journey back to those frozen epochs and discover how ice didn't just shape the land. It shaped us, the Great Cooling Picture. The world 2.6 million years ago, when the first whispers of the Great Cooling began to stir across the planet. The Earth had been warm for millions of years, a greenhouse world where palm trees grew in Alaska and crocodiles basked in Arctic waters. But something was changing, something so gradual that no single generation of early hominids would have noticed, yet so profound that it would reshape every continent, every ocean, every living thing. The ice began its slow march from the poles, creeping outward like fingers of crystal reaching across the land. At first it was just snow that didn't melt completely during summer, accumulating year after year in the high mountains and northern reaches. But snow has a memory, and as it compressed into ice, it began to remember the cold. Layer upon layer, century upon century, the ice grew thicker, heavier, more determined in its conquest of the world. In what would one day be called Scandinavia, ice sheets began to form that would eventually tower 2 miles high. Walls of frozen water so massive they pressed the very bedrock of the earth downward under their weight. Imagine standing at the edge of such a glacier, looking up at a cliff of blue-white ice that disappeared into the clouds above, knowing that this frozen giant stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. The sound it made was unlike anything in our modern world, a deep, constant groaning as the ice shifted and flowed, punctuated by the sharp crack of crevasses opening and the distant thunder of ice falls. But the ice was just the beginning. As more and more of the world's water became locked in these frozen fortresses, the oceans began to drop. Coastlines that had been underwater for millions of years suddenly emerged, creating land bridges between continents. The Bering Land Bridge, connecting Asia and North America, became a highway for life itself. The English Channel dried up, making Britain part of continental Europe. Indonesia became a vast peninsula extending from Southeast Asia. The world was literally reshaping itself, creating new paths for migration and new barriers to movement. Our early ancestors, still more ape than human, found themselves living in a world that was becoming increasingly unpredictable. The forests they had called home for millions of years began to shrink and fragment as the climate grew colder and drier. Grasslands expanded where jungles once thrived. Rivers changed course as the land itself rose and fell under the weight of the ice. Food sources that had been reliable for countless generations suddenly became scarce or disappeared entirely. This wasn't just environmental change, this was evolutionary pressure of the most intense kind. Those early hominids who could adapt, who could think more flexibly, who could cooperate more effectively, who could use tools more skillfully, were the ones who survived. The ice was selecting for intelligence, for creativity, for the very traits that would eventually make us human. Archaeological evidence from this period tells a story of rapid innovation. Stone tools became more sophisticated, more specialized. Fire, that most human of technologies, became not just useful but essential for survival in the cooling world. The controlled use of fire allowed our ancestors to extend their range into colder climates, to cook food and extract more nutrition from limited resources, to gather in groups around the warmth and light, sharing stories and knowledge that would be passed down through generations. But there's something else in the archaeological record from this time, something that hints at changes far deeper than just tool use and fire control. The brain cases of our ancestors began to expand rapidly during the Ice Age, growing from the 400 cubic centimeters of early Australopithecines to the 400 cubic centimeters of modern humans. This wasn't gradual evolution. This was an explosion of neural development that coincided almost perfectly with the advance of the ice. What was driving this rapid brain growth? Some scientists point to the cognitive demands of surviving in an increasingly complex and unpredictable environment. Others suggest that the social cooperation required to survive the harsh conditions selected for individuals who could communicate more effectively, plan more strategically, and maintain larger social networks. But there are other theories, more speculative ones that venture into territory where science meets mystery. What if the Ice Age didn't just select for intelligence? What if it awakened something that was already dormant within us? Ancient myths from around the world speak of a time when humans gained knowledge from beings of ice and snow, when the frozen lands held secrets that transformed those who discovered them. The Norse spoke of the Jotuns, the frost giants who possessed ancient wisdom. The Inuit tell stories of Sedna, the goddess of the sea and ice, who taught humans the skills they needed to survive in the frozen world. Hindu texts describe the Himalayas as the abode of Shiva, where cosmic knowledge was preserved in ice and snow. Could these myths be more than just stories? Could they be cultural memories of a time when the ice itself was a teacher, when the extreme conditions of the glacial world forced our ancestors to develop not just intelligence, but consciousness itself? The timing is certainly suggestive. The period of most rapid brain growth in human evolution corresponds almost exactly with the most severe glacial periods. As the ice continued its advance, reaching its maximum extent around 20,000 years ago, vast areas of the northern continents became uninhabitable. But this wasn't just destruction. It was transformation. The ice was carving new landscapes, creating the valleys and lakes and mountain ranges that would define the geography of the post-glacial world. It was grinding rock into fertile soil that would nourish the first agricultural civilizations. It was storing fresh water that would feed the great rivers of the world when the ice finally retreated. And somewhere in this frozen world, our ancestors were becoming us. They were developing language complex enough to pass down detailed knowledge across generations. They were creating art that spoke to something deeper than mere survival. Cave paintings that captured not just the animals they hunted, but their relationship with the world around them. They were beginning to bury their dead with ceremony, suggesting an awareness of mortality and perhaps an afterlife that transcended the physical world. The ice was teaching them about time itself, the deep time of geological change, the cyclical time of seasons and migrations, the precious time of individual life in the face of vast impersonal forces. They learned to read the signs in the sky and the behavior of animals, to predict the weather and the movements of herds, to plan not just for tomorrow but for seasons and years ahead. But perhaps most importantly, the ice was teaching them about each other. In the harsh world of the glacial period, survival depended on cooperation on a scale never before seen in human evolution. Small bands had to work together to bring down massive prey animals like mammoths and woolly rhinoceros. They had to share resources during the long, dark winters when food was scarce. They had to care for the young, the old, and the injured, because every member of the group possessed knowledge and skills that might mean the difference between survival and extinction. This cooperation wasn't just practical. It is the foundation of human culture itself. Around the fires that kept them warm through the endless winter nights, our ancestors began to tell stories, to sing songs, to create the myths and legends that would bind communities together across vast distances and long periods of time. They developed rituals and ceremonies that reinforced social bonds and passed down essential knowledge. They began to see themselves not just as individuals struggling to survive, but as part of something larger, a tribe, a people, a species with a shared destiny. And as the ice reached its maximum extent and began its slow retreat, these transformed humans were ready to inherit a world that has been completely remade by the glacial forces. But that inheritance would come with its own mysteries, its own challenges, and its own secrets buried deep beneath the melting ice. The memory of water. As the great ice sheets began their retreat around 15,000 years ago, they left behind more than just carved landscapes and fertile valleys. They left behind water, vast quantities of it, released suddenly and catastrophically as the climate warmed and the frozen dams that had held back entire oceans of meltwater finally gave way. What followed was a period of flooding so extensive, so dramatic, that it may have inspired every flood myth in human history. Imagine the scene as the Laurentide ice sheet, which had covered most of Canada and the northern United States, began to collapse. Glacial Lake Missoula, a body of water larger than Lake Erie and Lake Ontario combined, was held back by an ice dam in what is now Montana. When that dam failed, the entire lake emptied in a matter of days, sending a wall of water racing across the Pacific Northwest at speeds of up to 80 miles per hour. The flood carved the channeled scablands of eastern Washington, creating a landscape so alien that early geologists couldn't believe it had been formed by water alone. But Lake Missoula was just one of hundreds of such glacial lakes scattered across the northern continents. As the ice retreated, these massive bodies of water were released in a series of mega-floods that dwarfed anything in recorded human history. The Black Sea, once a much smaller freshwater lake, was suddenly connected to the Mediterranean when rising sea levels breached the natural dam at the Bosphorus. The resulting flood filled the Black Sea basin in a matter of months, submerging thousands of square miles of coastal settlements and forcing entire populations to flee to higher ground. Could this be the source of the flood stories that appear in cultures around the world? The Epic of Gilgamesh, written in ancient Mesopotamia, tells of Utnapishtim, who survived a great flood by building an ark. The Hebrew Bible speaks of Noah and the deluge that covered the earth. Hindu texts describe Manu, who was saved from a world-destroying flood by a great fish. The Greeks told of Deucalion and Pyrrha, the only survivors of a flood sent by Zeus to cleanse the world. Native American tribes from the Pacific Northwest to the Great Plains have flood stories that speak of waters rising to cover the mountains themselves. These aren't just similar stories, they're remarkably consistent in their details. They speak of floods that came suddenly without warning, covering vast areas of land. They describe survivors who preserved not just themselves, but the knowledge and animals necessary to rebuild civilization. They often mention specific geographical features, mountains, valleys, rivers, that correspond to areas we now know were dramatically affected by glacial flooding. But the flood myths contain another element that's harder to explain through geology alone. They speak of the floods as divine punishment, as a cleansing of the world, as the end of one age and the beginning of another. They describe the survivors as chosen ones, people who possess special knowledge or virtue that allowed them to escape the destruction. And they often mention that the floods revealed things that had been hidden: ancient cities, buried treasures, forgotten wisdom that had been preserved beneath the waters. What if these stories aren't just cultural memories of natural disasters? What if they're describing something more profound? The moment when the Ice Age ended and humanity emerged into a new world, carrying with them the accumulated wisdom of tens of thousands of years of glacial survival. The timing certainly fits. The major flood events that followed the ice retreat occurred between 15,000 and 8,000 years ago, precisely the period when human civilization began to take recognizable form. Archaeological evidence from this period is tantalizing but frustratingly incomplete. Underwater archaeologists have discovered submerged settlements off the coasts of India, Japan, and the Mediterranean that date to the end of the Ice Age. These aren't simple hunter-gatherer camps. They show evidence of sophisticated construction techniques, complex social organization, and advanced knowledge of astronomy and mathematics. The problem is that most of the coastal areas where such settlements would have existed are now under hundreds of feet of water, making systematic exploration nearly impossible. But there are hints of what might be hidden beneath the waves. Off the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni Monument presents a puzzle that has divided archaeologists for decades. This massive stone structure, now 75 feet underwater, appears to show clear evidence of human modification. Straight edges, right angles, carved steps and platforms that seem too regular to be natural formations. If it is artificial, it would have been built when sea levels were much lower during the Ice Age itself. But who could have possessed the knowledge and technology to create such a monument during humanity's supposed infancy? Similar mysteries exist around the world. The megalithic structures at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, built around 11,000 years ago, demonstrate a level of astronomical knowledge and construction skill that shouldn't have existed according to conventional timelines of human development. The site was deliberately buried around 8,000 years ago, as if its builders wanted to preserve it for future discovery. Why would a supposedly primitive people undertake such a massive project? And why would they then hide it from the world? The answer might lie in the nature of Ice Age civilization itself. What if the harsh conditions of the glacial period didn't just select for intelligence and cooperation, but actually fostered the development of advanced knowledge systems that were later lost when the ice retreated and human populations dispersed? Think about it. During the Ice Age, human groups were small, isolated, and completely dependent on their accumulated knowledge for survival. Every piece of information about weather patterns, animal behavior, plant properties, and seasonal changes was literally a matter of life and death. In such conditions, knowledge wouldn't just be preserved, it would be refined, tested, and passed down with religious devotion. Shamans and wise elders would have been the repositories of vast amounts of practical and theoretical knowledge, from the medicinal properties of plants to the movements of stars and planets. They would have developed sophisticated systems for encoding and transmitting this information across generations, using stories, songs, rituals, and perhaps even monumental architecture as memory aids. When the ice retreated and human populations exploded, this concentrated knowledge would have been diluted and fragmented. The small, tight-knit groups that had preserved complex information systems for thousands of years suddenly found themselves in a world where survival was easier, where specialization was possible, where not everyone needed to know everything. The shamanic traditions that had maintained the old knowledge would have been gradually replaced by more specialized forms of learning: agriculture, metallurgy, writing, mathematics, each powerful in its own right but lacking the holistic integration of the Ice Age wisdom traditions. But some groups might have tried to preserve the old knowledge, encoding it in myths and monuments that could survive the transition to the new world. The flood stories themselves might be part of this preservation effort, not just memories of natural disasters, but coded instructions for maintaining the essential knowledge that had allowed humanity to survive the Ice Age. The survivors in these stories aren't just lucky individuals who escaped drowning. They're the keepers of ancient wisdom, chosen to carry the accumulated learning of the glacial period into the post-flood world. This interpretation gains support from the consistent themes that appear in flood myths around the world. The survivors are always described as righteous or wise, people who possessed special knowledge or maintained proper relationships with the divine. They preserve not just themselves, but representatives of all life, the animals on Noah's Ark, the seeds saved by various flood heroes in different cultures, and they often receive new knowledge or divine revelations after the flood, as if the catastrophe itself was a test or initiation that qualified them to receive higher wisdom. The flood myths also consistently describe the post-flood world as different from what came before, not just physically, but spiritually and culturally. The survivors must learn to live in new ways, to adapt to changed conditions, to rebuild civilization from the ground up. But they do so with the benefit of the knowledge they preserved from the previous world, knowledge that allows them to create something greater than what existed before the flood. Could this be describing the actual transition from Ice Age to post-glacial civilization? The archaeological record shows that human culture underwent rapid and dramatic changes during the period of glacial retreat and flooding. Agriculture appeared almost simultaneously in multiple locations around the world. Monumental architecture began to be constructed on an unprecedented scale. Writing systems developed independently in several different regions. Astronomical knowledge reached levels of sophistication that wouldn't be matched again for thousands of years. It's as if humanity suddenly remembered how to be civilized, as if knowledge that had been preserved through the long glacial night was finally being put to use in building the post-flood world. The flood myths might be cultural memories of this transition, stories that preserve not just the trauma of the great meltwater floods, but the triumph of human knowledge and wisdom surviving the end of one world and the beginning of another. But if this interpretation is correct, it raises profound questions about what else might be preserved in the myths and monuments of the ancient world. What other knowledge from the Ice Age might be encoded in stories we've dismissed as primitive superstition? What technologies and insights might be hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to develop the wisdom to recognize and decode them? And what about the knowledge that wasn't preserved? The wisdom that was lost when the ice retreated and the old world disappeared beneath the rising waters? How much of human potential was submerged along with those coastal settlements, buried beneath the advancing forests, or simply forgotten as our ancestors adapted to their new circumstances? The water remembers, even if we have forgotten. In the depths of the oceans, in the sediments of ancient lake beds, in the ice cores that still preserve samples of the glacial atmosphere, the evidence of what we once were and what we once knew continues to wait for discovery. But perhaps the most important memories are preserved not in the physical world, but in the stories themselves, in the myths and legends that have survived every catastrophe, every cultural transformation, every attempt to reduce human history to simple narratives of progress and development. As we'll see, the ice didn't just shape our bodies and our minds during those long glacial millennia. It shaped our souls, our dreams, our deepest understanding of what it means to be human in a universe that is both beautiful and terrible, both nurturing and destructive, and those lessons, encoded in stories of floods and survivors, of hidden knowledge and divine wisdom, continue to speak to us across the vast gulf of time that separates us from our Ice Age ancestors, the wanderers. When the great ice sheets reached their maximum extent 20,000 years ago, they didn't just lock up water and reshape continents, they created a world of wanderers, forcing our ancestors into migrations that would scatter humanity across every habitable corner of the earth. But these weren't random movements of desperate refugees fleeing the cold. They were purposeful journeys undertaken by people who had learned to read the subtle signs of a changing world, who possessed knowledge of navigation and survival that allowed them to traverse landscapes that would challenge even modern explorers. The story of these migrations is written in our genes, in the archaeological record, and perhaps most mysteriously, in the myths and legends that speak of great journeys undertaken by heroes and gods in the distant past. It's a story that challenges everything we think we know about the capabilities of Ice Age humans, suggesting that our ancestors possessed not just the physical courage to venture into unknown territories, but the intellectual sophistication to plan and execute journeys that spanned continents and generations. Consider the peopling of the Americas, one of the most remarkable achievements in human history. Around 15,000 years ago, when the Bering Land Bridge connected Asia and North America, small groups of hunters began crossing from Siberia into Alaska. But this wasn't a simple walk across dry land. It was a journey through one of the harshest environments on Earth, a landscape of tundra and ice where temperatures could drop to 60 degrees below zero, and where the sun disappeared for months at a time during the Arctic winter. The people who made this crossing weren't just surviving, they were thriving. Archaeological evidence from sites like Bluefish Caves in the Yukon shows that these early Americans possessed sophisticated tool technologies, complex social organizations, and detailed knowledge of Arctic ecology. They knew how to hunt mammoth and other megafauna, how to preserve meat through the long winter months, how to make clothing and shelter that could protect them from the extreme cold. They had developed techniques for traveling across snow and ice, for finding their way in a landscape where landmarks could be obscured by blizzards for weeks at a time. But perhaps most remarkably, they possessed the cultural knowledge necessary to maintain their identity and purpose across generations of travel. The journey from Siberia to the southern tip of South America, a distance of more than 10,000 miles through every conceivable type of terrain and climate, wasn't completed by a single group or even a single generation. It was a multi-generational migration that required each group to pass down not just survival skills, but the memory of where they had come from and the vision of where they were going. How did they do it? How did small bands of Ice Age hunters maintain the cultural cohesion necessary to undertake journeys that lasted centuries? The answer might lie in the shamanic traditions that appear to have been universal among Ice Age peoples. Shamans weren't just spiritual leaders, they were the keepers of practical knowledge, the human libraries who preserved information about geography, weather patterns, animal behavior, and seasonal cycles. They were also the storytellers who maintained the cultural narratives that gave meaning and direction to the long journeys. In many Native American traditions, the migration stories speak of spirit guides who led the people across the land bridge and down through the Americas. These weren't just metaphorical guides, they were specific instructions encoded in mythological form, telling the migrants which routes to follow, which landmarks to look for, which resources to exploit along the way. The stories describe a world that matches the archaeological and geological evidence for Ice Age America. A landscape of giant animals, massive floods, and dramatic climate changes that required constant adaptation and movement. But the Americas weren't the only destination for Ice Age wanderers. At roughly the same time that humans were crossing the Bering Land Bridge, other groups were undertaking equally remarkable journeys in different parts of the world. The peopling of Australia, which required ocean crossings even during the Ice Age when sea levels were much lower, demonstrates that our ancestors possessed sophisticated maritime technologies and navigation skills at least 50,000 years ago. The journey to Australia wasn't just a matter of building boats and hoping for the best. It required detailed knowledge of ocean currents, wind patterns, and celestial navigation. The migrants would have needed to understand the seasonal movements of fish and birds, the locations of islands where they could rest and resupply, the techniques for preserving fresh water during long ocean voyages. They would have needed to coordinate the movements of multiple boats carrying different groups, ensuring that genetic diversity was maintained and that essential knowledge and skills were distributed across the migrating population. Archaeological evidence from sites like Lake Mungo in southeastern Australia shows that the first Australians weren't just surviving in their new environment. They were creating sophisticated cultures that included complex burial practices, artistic traditions, and technological innovations. The famous Mungo lady, whose remains date to around 40,000 years ago, was buried with elaborate ceremonies that included the use of ochre pigments and carefully arranged grave goods. This suggests that the migrants brought with them not just the practical knowledge necessary for survival, but the cultural and spiritual traditions that define their identity as human beings. Similar patterns appear in the archaeological record from other Ice Age migrations. The movement of modern humans into Europe around 40,000 years ago coincided with an explosion of artistic and technological innovation that archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. Cave paintings, carved figurines, sophisticated tool technologies, and complex burial practices all appeared within a relatively short period of time, suggesting that the migrants brought with them cultural knowledge that had been developed over thousands of years in Africa and Asia. But there's something else in the European archaeological record that hints at knowledge systems far more sophisticated than we might expect from supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers. The cave paintings at sites like Lascaux and Chauvet aren't just artistic expressions. They're complex information storage systems that encode detailed knowledge about animal behavior, seasonal cycles, and astronomical observations. The paintings show animals in specific poses and contexts that correspond to particular times of year and particular hunting strategies. They include abstract symbols and geometric patterns that appear to represent calendrical information and possibly even mathematical concepts. The famous Venus figurines found across Ice Age Europe present another puzzle. These small carved figures, depicting women with exaggerated sexual characteristics, have been interpreted as fertility symbols or goddess figures. But recent analysis suggests they might be something more practical. Three-dimensional maps that encoded information about the locations of resources, the routes between different territories, and the relationships between different groups. The variations in the figurines' proportions and decorative elements might represent a sophisticated system for storing and transmitting geographical and social information across vast distances and long periods of time. This interpretation gained support from ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies, which show that such groups often use artistic and ritual objects as memory aids for preserving complex information. The Aboriginal Australians, for example, use song lines, mythological narratives that describe the journeys of ancestral beings, as detailed maps of the landscape, encoding information about water sources, food locations, and safe travel routes across thousands of miles of desert terrain. Could the Ice Age migrations have been guided by similar systems of encoded knowledge? Could the myths and legends that speak of great journeys undertaken by gods and heroes actually be cultural memories of the real migrations that scattered humanity across the globe? The timing certainly fits. Many of the world's migration myths describe journeys that took place during periods of great cold, when the world was covered with ice and snow, when sea levels were lower, and land bridges connected continents that are now separated by water. The Norse myths speak of the Aesir, gods who travelled from the east to establish their kingdom in Scandinavia, bringing with them knowledge of magic and technology that transformed the northern lands. Hindu texts describe the migration of the Aryans from their original homeland in the north, a journey that took them across mountains and rivers to establish new civilizations in the south. Native American traditions tell of the emergence of the first people from underground worlds, their journey across a great bridge of ice, and their dispersal across the Americas under the guidance of animal spirits and supernatural beings. These stories share common elements that correspond remarkably well to what we know about Ice Age migrations. They describe journeys that lasted for generations, led by wise guides who possessed special knowledge of navigation and survival. They speak of crossing great bodies of water, traversing frozen landscapes, and adapting to new environments that required different survival strategies. They often mention the preservation of sacred objects or knowledge that connected the migrants to their ancestral homeland and provided guidance for establishing new communities. But perhaps most intriguingly, many of these migration myths describe the discovery of ancient ruins or artifacts during the journey, evidence of previous civilizations that had risen and fallen before the current migration began. Could these be cultural memories of encounters with the remains of earlier human settlements? Evidence that the Ice Age world was more densely populated and more culturally sophisticated than we currently believe? Recent archaeological discoveries are beginning to support this possibility. Sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, with its massive stone circles and sophisticated astronomical alignments, demonstrate that complex monumental architecture was being constructed during the late Ice Age by people who were supposedly simple hunter-gatherers. The site shows evidence of occupation by different groups over thousands of years, suggesting that it served as a gathering place or pilgrimage destination for migrants travelling across the region. Similar sites are being discovered around the world, often in locations that would have been strategic stopping points along Ice Age migration routes. These aren't just temporary camps, they're permanent installations that required massive investments of time and labour, suggesting that the migrants possessed not just the knowledge necessary for survival, but the social organisation and long-term planning capabilities necessary for major construction projects. What were these sites for? Why would nomadic peoples invest so much effort in creating permanent monuments? One possibility is that they served as information storage and transmission centres, places where different groups could gather to share knowledge, trade resources, and coordinate their movements across vast territories. The astronomical alignments found at many of these sites suggest that they were used for calendrical purposes, helping migrants time their journeys to coincide with favourable weather conditions and seasonal resource availability. But there might be another explanation, one that ventures into more speculative territory. What if these sites were part of a global network of knowledge preservation centres established by Ice Age peoples who understood that their world was changing and that their accumulated wisdom needed to be preserved for future generations? What if the Great Migrations weren't just responses to environmental pressure, but deliberate efforts to establish human presence in every corner of the world, ensuring that no single catastrophe could destroy the knowledge and culture that had been developed over tens of thousands of years of glacial survival? This interpretation would explain why the migrations were so successful, why they resulted in the establishment of sophisticated cultures in every environment, from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest. It would also explain why the myths and legends that describe these journeys consistently speak of the migrants as carriers of divine knowledge, chosen people who were entrusted with preserving and transmitting the wisdom of the ancestors. As the ice began its final retreat and the Great Migrations drew to a close, humanity found itself scattered across the globe but connected by shared memories of the journey, shared knowledge of survival and adaptation, and shared stories that preserved the wisdom of the wandering years. But the end of the migrations didn't mean the end of the mysteries they had created. In fact, it was just the beginning of new questions about what our ancestors had accomplished during their long journey through the Ice Age world, and what secrets they might have left behind for us to discover. The Keepers of the Cold. In the deepest caves of the Himalayas, Tibetan monks speak of ancient texts that describe a time when the world was ruled by ice, when beings of great wisdom dwelt in crystal palaces beneath the glaciers, teaching selected humans the secrets of survival in the frozen world. In the oral traditions of the Inuit, elders tell of Sedna, the goddess of the sea and ice, who possessed knowledge of the deep currents and the movements of the great ice sheets, knowledge that she shared with those who proved themselves worthy through trials of endurance and wisdom. These aren't just isolated myths from remote cultures. Around the world, in traditions separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, we find consistent stories of Ice Age wisdom keepers, beings who possessed advanced knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and technology, who lived in harmony with the frozen world and who passed their knowledge to human survivors before disappearing into legend. Could these stories be more than just mythology? Could they be cultural memories of actual encounters with advanced Ice Age civilizations that we have yet to discover? The possibility seems remote by conventional archaeological standards. We're taught that Ice Age humans were simple hunter-gatherers, struggling to survive in a harsh world with primitive tools and basic social organization. But the evidence for this view is surprisingly thin, based largely on the assumption that technological complexity requires large populations, permanent settlements, and agricultural surplus, conditions that supposedly didn't exist during the Ice Age. But what if we've been looking at Ice Age civilization through the wrong lens? What if the harsh conditions of the glacial world actually fostered the development of knowledge systems that were more sophisticated than anything that came after, precisely because survival depended on understanding and working with natural forces rather than trying to dominate them? What if the small, mobile populations of the Ice Age weren't a sign of primitive development, but of advanced adaptation to a world where flexibility and deep knowledge were more valuable than large numbers and permanent infrastructure? Consider the astronomical knowledge that appears in Ice Age archaeological sites. The cave paintings at Lascaux include star maps that accurately depict the positions of constellations as they appeared 17,000 years ago. The bone carvings found at sites across Europe contain notational systems that track lunar cycles with mathematical precision. The megalithic structures built during the Late Ice Age demonstrate understanding of complex astronomical phenomena like the precession of the equinoxes, knowledge that requires centuries of careful observation and sophisticated mathematical analysis. This wasn't just practical knowledge for navigation and timekeeping. The level of astronomical sophistication found in Ice Age sites suggests that our ancestors possessed theoretical understanding of celestial mechanics that wouldn't be matched again until the development of modern astronomy. They understood that the Earth's axis wobbles over long periods of time, causing the positions of stars to shift gradually across the centuries. They knew about the complex cycles that govern the Earth's orbit around the Sun, cycles that affect climate patterns over thousands of years. How did they acquire this knowledge? The conventional explanation is that it developed gradually through thousands of years of careful observation by hunter-gatherer societies. But there's a problem with this explanation. It requires not just observation, but the mathematical and theoretical framework necessary to interpret the observations and extract meaningful patterns from them. It requires the kind of abstract thinking and symbolic representation that we associate with advanced civilizations, not with supposedly primitive nomadic groups. The myths of the wisdom keepers offer a different explanation. They speak of teachers who possessed this knowledge already, who had preserved it from an even earlier time, and who passed it on to selected human students during the Ice Age. These teachers are described in remarkably consistent terms across different cultures, as beings who were human-like but somehow different, who lived much longer than ordinary humans, who possessed technologies that seemed magical to those who encountered them, and who dwelt in hidden places where they preserved vast libraries of knowledge. The Hindu Puranas speak of the Saptarishis, the 7 sages who preserved the Vedic knowledge through the long night of cosmic dissolution. The texts describe them as living in the Himalayas during periods of great cold, maintaining the sacred fires and the oral traditions that contained the essential knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and spiritual practice. When the world was ready, they would emerge from their mountain retreats to re-establish civilization and pass on their wisdom to new generations of students. Similar figures appear in other traditions. The Chinese speak of the 8 immortals, beings who achieved transcendence through mastery of natural forces and who appeared at crucial moments in history to guide human development. The Celtic traditions describe the Tuatha De Danann, a race of godlike beings who possessed advanced knowledge of metallurgy, agriculture, and magic, and who retreated to hidden realms when the world changed around them. The Norse myths tell of the Aesir, who came from the east bringing knowledge of runes, poetry, and technology that transformed Scandinavian culture. But the myths also speak of an earlier race, the Jotuns or frost giants, who possessed even more ancient wisdom and who dwelt in the frozen realms at the edges of the world. These beings are described as the original inhabitants of the northern lands, masters of ice and snow who understood the deep patterns that governed the glacial cycles. What's particularly intriguing about these myths is their consistency in describing the wisdom keepers as masters of what we might call environmental technology, knowledge of how to work with natural forces rather than against them. They're described as understanding the properties of crystals and metals, the behaviour of water in all its forms, the patterns of wind and weather, the cycles of plant and animal life. They possessed healing knowledge that worked with the body's natural processes, architectural techniques that harmonized with geological forces, and agricultural methods that enhanced, rather than depleted, the fertility of the land. This description matches remarkably well with what we're beginning to understand about the actual capabilities of Ice Age peoples. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed evidence of sophisticated technologies that worked with natural processes rather than trying to overcome them. Ice Age peoples developed techniques for preserving food that were more effective than modern refrigeration, methods for creating clothing that provided better insulation than synthetic materials, and construction techniques that created structures capable of withstanding extreme weather conditions without requiring external energy sources. They also possessed medical knowledge that in some cases exceeded modern capabilities. Analysis of Ice Age skeletons shows evidence of successful surgical procedures, including trepanation, the removal of sections of skull bone, that was performed with tools and techniques that left patients not just alive but apparently healthy for years after the operation. They understood the medicinal properties of plants and minerals, developing pharmacological knowledge that form the basis for traditional medicine systems that are still effective today. But perhaps most remarkably, they possessed psychological and social technologies that allowed small groups to maintain complex knowledge systems across thousands of years without writing. The shamanic traditions that appear to have been universal among Ice Age peoples weren't just religious practices. They were sophisticated methods for encoding, storing, and transmitting vast amounts of practical and theoretical knowledge through oral traditions, ritual practices, and symbolic systems. Modern cognitive science is beginning to understand how these systems worked. The human brain has enormous capacity for storing and processing information, but accessing that capacity requires specific techniques for organizing and encoding information in ways that seem almost supernatural to modern observers trained to rely on external storage systems. The Aboriginal Australians, whose culture has remained largely unchanged for over 40,000 years, demonstrate how this works in practice. Their songlines, mythological narratives that describe the journeys of ancestral beings across the landscape, contain detailed geographical, botanical, astronomical, and historical information encoded in story form. A single song cycle can contain navigational instructions for traversing hundreds of miles of desert, seasonal information about water and food sources, genealogical data spanning dozens of generations, and astronomical observations covering thousands of years of sky watching. The key to these systems is their integration of multiple types of knowledge into coherent narratives that engage not just the analytical mind, but the emotional, visual, and kinesthetic learning systems as well. Information encoded in story, song, dance, and ritual is processed by multiple brain regions simultaneously, creating redundant storage pathways that make the knowledge virtually impossible to lose or corrupt. The shamanic traditions of the Ice Age almost certainly operated on similar principles, allowing small groups of humans to carry within their minds libraries of knowledge that would challenge modern computer systems. But the myths of the wisdom keepers suggest something even more intriguing, that these knowledge systems weren't just developed by individual cultures working in isolation, but were part of a global network of information sharing that connected Ice Age peoples across vast distances and maintained consistency of knowledge over thousands of years. The astronomical alignments found at megalithic sites around the world show remarkable similarities, despite being separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. The mathematical constants found in ancient architecture, pi, phi, the square root of 2, appear with such consistency across different cultures that some researchers have suggested they must have had a common source. Could that source have been the wisdom keepers described in myth, master teachers who possessed advanced knowledge and who travelled from place to place, establishing schools or training centres where selected students could learn the essential knowledge needed to maintain civilization during the harsh conditions of the Ice Age? The myths consistently describe these teachers as wanderers, beings who would appear when they were needed, establish their teachings, and then disappear again into the hidden places where they preserved the greater knowledge. The location of these hidden places is another consistent element in the myths. They're invariably described as being in the most remote and inhospitable regions of the world. High mountains, deep caves, frozen wastes, underground chambers. Places where only the most dedicated seekers would venture, where the knowledge could be preserved safe from the catastrophes that periodically swept across the more accessible regions of the world. Modern archaeology is beginning to find evidence that such places actually existed. High-altitude archaeological sites in the Himalayas, the Andes and other mountain ranges show evidence of human occupation during periods when the climate was so harsh that survival would have required extraordinary knowledge and resources. These sites aren't just temporary refuges, they show evidence of permanent settlements with sophisticated architecture, advanced metallurgy, and complex astronomical installations. The site of Nan Madol in Micronesia presents a particularly intriguing example. This massive complex of stone structures, built on artificial islands connected by a network of canals, demonstrates engineering capabilities that challenge our understanding of prehistoric technology. The basalt logs used in its construction, some weighing over 50 tons, were quarried from sites miles away and transported across open ocean using methods that remain mysterious even today. The complex includes features that suggest it was designed as a centre for astronomical observation and mathematical calculation, with alignments that track celestial cycles spanning thousands of years. But perhaps the most mysterious aspect of Nan Madol is its age. While conventional archaeology dates the visible structures to around 1200 CE, there's evidence that the site was occupied much earlier. Underwater archaeology has revealed additional structures beneath the current sea level that would have been built when ocean levels were much lower during the Ice Age itself. If this dating is correct, Nan Madol might be one of the few surviving examples of the kind of knowledge centres described in the Wisdom Keeper myths. Similar patterns appear at other sites around the world. The underwater structures off the coast of Japan, India and the Mediterranean show evidence of sophisticated planning and construction that predates conventional timelines for human civilization. The megalithic complexes of Europe and Asia demonstrate astronomical knowledge that shouldn't have existed according to our current understanding of prehistoric capabilities. The precision stone cutting found at sites like Pumapunku in Bolivia shows mastery of techniques that we're only beginning to understand even with modern technology. What ties all these sites together is their location in regions that would have been climatically favourable during the Ice Age, and their apparent abandonment or burial around the time of the great meltwater floods that marked the end of the glacial period. It's as if a global civilization that adapted to Ice Age conditions was forced to abandon its major centres when the climate changed, preserving what knowledge it could in hidden locations, while the rest was lost beneath the rising waters or buried under advancing forests and deserts. The Wisdom Keeper myths might be cultural memories of the final phase of this process, the period when the last guardians of Ice Age knowledge were establishing preservation sites and training final generations of students before disappearing into legend. The consistency of these myths across cultures suggests that this wasn't just a local phenomenon, but a global effort to preserve essential knowledge through the transition from one world to another. But what happened to the wisdom keepers themselves? The myths offer tantalizingly vague answers. Some traditions say they withdrew to hidden realms where they continued to exist, waiting for the right time to return and restore the ancient knowledge. Others suggest they transcended physical existence altogether, becoming part of the natural world they had learned to understand so deeply. Still others hint that they transformed themselves in some fundamental way, evolving beyond ordinary human limitations to become something new. Modern genetics might offer a clue to what really happened. Recent studies of human DNA have revealed traces of genetic material that doesn't match any known human population. Fragments of genetic code that appear to derive from groups that diverge from mainstream humanity tens of thousands of years ago and then reintegrated with the general population during the late Ice Age. Could these be genetic traces of the wisdom keeper populations, groups that had adapted so thoroughly to Ice Age conditions that they became genetically distinct from other humans? The implications are staggering. If the wisdom keepers were real, if they possessed the advanced knowledge attributed to them in myth, then the end of the Ice Age represents not just a climate transition, but the loss of an entire civilization, one that might have been more sophisticated in some ways than our own. The knowledge they preserved might still exist in fragmentary form, encoded in myths and monuments that we haven't learned to decode, waiting for us to develop the wisdom to understand what our ancestors tried to preserve for us. But there's another possibility, one that the myths themselves suggest. What if the wisdom keepers didn't disappear? What if they simply changed their methods, adapting to the new conditions of the post-glacial world by working through existing human institutions rather than maintaining separate communities? What if the sudden flowering of civilization that occurred around the world after the Ice Age, the development of agriculture, metallurgy, writing, mathematics, and monumental architecture, wasn't independent human achievement, but the result of ancient knowledge being carefully reintroduced into human society by teachers who understood how to work with natural processes of cultural development? This interpretation would explain the mysterious consistency of early civilizations, the way similar technologies and ideas appeared simultaneously in widely separated regions, the advanced knowledge of astronomy and mathematics that characterized the earliest written records. It would also explain why many ancient texts claim to be preservations of much older knowledge, why the earliest civilizations consistently looked backward to golden ages of wisdom and knowledge that had been lost in catastrophes and floods. The wisdom keepers might not be gone. They might simply have become invisible, working through human institutions and cultural processes to guide the redevelopment of civilization in ways that preserved the essential knowledge while allowing for adaptation to new conditions. The shamanic traditions that still exist in remote regions of the world, the mystery schools that preserved esoteric knowledge through the rise and fall of empires, the scientific traditions that maintain continuity of inquiry across cultural transformations, all of these might be modern manifestations of the same wisdom-keeping function that the Ice Age masters performed during the glacial period. If this is true, then the story of the Ice Age isn't just ancient history. It's a continuing process of which we are still a part. The knowledge that allowed our ancestors to survive the Great Cooling, to adapt to the dramatic changes of the meltwater period, to establish the foundations of post-glacial civilization, might still be available to us if we learn to recognize it and access it properly. The challenges we face today, climate change, resource depletion, social fragmentation, the need to develop sustainable relationships with natural systems, might be exactly the kind of challenges that the Ice Age wisdom was designed to address. But first, we need to understand what really happened during those mysterious millennia when ice ruled the world and our ancestors learned the secrets of survival in a cosmos that was both beautiful and terrible, nurturing and destructive. We need to look beyond the conventional narratives of primitive hunters struggling against hostile nature and recognize the possibility that the Ice Age was actually humanity's first great university, a planetary classroom where we learn the fundamental lessons that still define our deepest nature and our highest potential, the consciousness of ice. There's something about ice that changes human consciousness. Modern neuroscientists have documented how exposure to extreme cold alters brain function, increasing activity in regions associated with heightened awareness, expanded perception, and what can only be described as transcendent states of consciousness. Tibetan monks who practice Tummo meditation report achieving states of expanded awareness while sitting naked in freezing temperatures, their bodies generating enough internal heat to melt snow while their minds access forms of knowledge unavailable under normal conditions. But what if this relationship between cold and consciousness isn't just a curious side effect of human physiology? What if it represents something much more fundamental, a deep connection between the crystalline structure of ice and the quantum processes that underlie awareness itself? What if the Ice Age didn't just select for intelligence, but actually awakened forms of consciousness that remain largely dormant in our warm, comfortable modern world? The idea sounds mystical, even absurd by contemporary scientific standards. But the evidence for unusual states of consciousness during the Ice Age is surprisingly strong, encoded not just in myths and legends, but in the archaeological record itself. The cave paintings of the Upper Paleolithic aren't just artistic expressions. They're windows into minds that experienced reality in ways that seem almost alien to modern consciousness. Consider the famous paintings at Chauvet Cave in southern France, created around 36,000 years ago, during one of the harshest periods of the last Ice Age. The artists who created these images weren't just recording what they saw, they were depicting animals and landscapes with an accuracy and depth of perception that surpasses photographic realism. The horses run with anatomically perfect gaits captured in mid-stride. The lions show individual personality traits that could only be observed through prolonged, intimate contact with living animals. The rhinoceros displays subtle behaviours that modern zoologists have only recently documented through years of careful field study. But more remarkably, many of the animals are depicted in ways that suggest the artist could see them from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Horses are shown from above, below, and from the side, all in the same image. Bison appear to be viewed from both inside and outside their bodies, showing not just external form but internal structure and vital essence. Some figures seem to shift and transform as you look at them, suggesting the artists were depicting not static forms, but dynamic processes of becoming and change. This isn't the work of primitive minds struggling to represent what they see. This is the product of consciousness that experienced reality in ways that integrated multiple dimensions of perception: spatial, temporal, energetic, and what can only be called spiritual. The Ice Age artists weren't just painting animals, they were painting their relationships with animals, their understanding of animal consciousness, their perception of the underlying patterns that connected all forms of life. Similar evidence appears in the carved figurines and decorated objects found at Ice Age sites across Europe and Asia. The famous Venus figurines show mathematical proportions that encode sophisticated understanding of human anatomy, reproductive cycles, and astronomical phenomena. But they also show something else: evidence of consciousness that could perceive the connections between human biology and cosmic processes, between individual bodies and universal patterns. The bone carvings and notational systems found at Ice Age sites demonstrate mathematical and astronomical knowledge that required not just careful observation, but intuitive insight into the deep structures of space and time. The lunar calendars carved on mammoth tusks track not just the obvious 29-day cycle of moon phases, but the more subtle 18.6-year cycle of lunar standstills, a pattern that requires decades of observation to detect and mathematical sophistication to calculate precisely. How did Ice Age peoples develop such knowledge? The conventional explanation focuses on practical necessity, the need to track seasonal changes for hunting and gathering, the importance of celestial navigation for long-distance travel. But this explanation doesn't account for the level of theoretical understanding evident in the archaeological record, the kind of abstract mathematical thinking that seems to serve no immediate survival purpose. The myths and legends of Ice Age peoples offer a different explanation, one that speaks of consciousness expansion, of direct perception of natural patterns, of minds that could access information through non-ordinary means. The shamanic traditions that appear to have been universal among Ice Age cultures weren't just religious practices. They were sophisticated technologies for altering consciousness, for accessing forms of awareness that could perceive reality from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Modern research into altered states of consciousness is beginning to validate what the shamanic traditions have always claimed, that human consciousness has capabilities far beyond what we normally experience, that under certain conditions the mind can access information through means that transcend ordinary sensory channels. Studies of meditation, psychedelic experiences, and extreme states induced by cold, fasting, or sensory deprivation show consistent patterns of expanded awareness, enhanced pattern recognition, and what subjects describe as direct perception of natural processes. The Ice Age environment might have been perfectly suited for inducing such states naturally. The extreme cold, the long nights, the social isolation of small groups, the constant proximity to death and transcendence. All of these are conditions that modern consciousness researchers recognize as powerful catalysts for non-ordinary awareness. The Ice Age peoples didn't need to seek out altered states. They lived in an environment that naturally induced them. But there's evidence that they also deliberately cultivated these states through sophisticated practices that integrated physical, mental, and spiritual techniques. The cave art itself shows clear signs of having been created during altered states of consciousness. The impossible perspectives, the fluid transformations, the integration of geometric patterns with naturalistic imagery. These aren't the products of ordinary waking consciousness, but of minds that had learned to access expanded forms of awareness. The locations of the cave art sites support this interpretation. They're invariably found in deep caves, often requiring dangerous journeys through narrow passages and underground chambers. The act of creating the art would have required extended periods in complete darkness, working by the light of small fires that would have created flickering shadows and moving patterns on the cave walls. The combination of sensory deprivation, physical challenge, and social isolation would have naturally induced trance states, creating optimal conditions for consciousness expansion. Recent research has revealed another remarkable aspect of the cave art sites. They were chosen for their acoustic properties. The chambers where the art appears have natural resonance characteristics that amplify certain frequencies, particularly those produced by human voices in chanting or singing. The artists weren't just working in visual isolation, but in acoustic environments that would have enhanced the consciousness-altering effects of their activities. This suggests that the creation of Ice Age art wasn't just individual expression, but communal ritual, shared experiences of consciousness expansion that bound communities together through participation in transcendent states. The artists weren't working alone, but as part of groups that supported and guided the journey into non-ordinary awareness, ensuring that the knowledge accessed during these states was preserved and transmitted to future generations. The geometric patterns that appear throughout Ice Age art, the spirals, grids, dots and zigzag lines, match remarkably with the visual phenomena reported by modern subjects during altered states of consciousness. These entoptic patterns appear to be universal features of human neurological function, phosphonies, and other visual artifacts produced by the nervous system itself during certain types of brain activity. The Ice Age artists were apparently depicting not just external reality, but the internal landscape of consciousness itself. But the geometric patterns in Ice Age art aren't just random neural artifacts. They show clear evidence of mathematical organization, of understanding that these internal phenomena follow predictable patterns that can be studied and utilized. The spiral patterns match the mathematical descriptions of natural forms, the growth patterns of shells, the structure of galaxies, the flow of water and wind. The grid patterns correspond to the crystal structures of minerals and ice. The dot patterns follow the same mathematical distributions found in quantum phenomena and particle physics. This suggests that Ice Age consciousness had access to information about the deep structure of reality that we're only beginning to understand through modern physics and mathematics. The shamanic traditions speak of this as direct perception of natural patterns, immediate awareness of the mathematical principles that govern physical reality. What if this wasn't just subjective experience, but actual access to objective information about the structure of space, time, matter, and energy? Modern physics has revealed that the universe is indeed structured according to mathematical principles that can be accessed through consciousness as well as through instruments and calculations. The quantum field theory that describes fundamental particles and forces shows remarkable parallels to the descriptions of reality found in shamanic and mystical traditions. The holographic principle that suggests the entire universe might be encoded in any small portion of space matches the shamanic understanding of reality as interconnected and mutually interpenetrating. The Ice Age peoples might have accessed this understanding not through abstract theoretical work, but through direct perception during altered states of consciousness. Their art and artifacts might be records not just of what they imagined, but of what they actually perceived about the deep structure of reality when their minds were freed from the constraints of ordinary waking consciousness. This interpretation helps explain some of the most puzzling aspects of Ice Age culture. The sudden appearance of sophisticated knowledge that seems to have no developmental history. The consistency of symbolic systems across vast distances and time periods. The integration of practical and theoretical knowledge that wouldn't be matched again until the development of modern science. If Ice Age peoples had access to expanded forms of consciousness that could perceive natural patterns directly, they wouldn't need to develop this knowledge gradually through trial and error. They could access it immediately through consciousness expansion techniques that were as much a part of their survival toolkit as stone tools and fire control. But there's another aspect of Ice Age consciousness that the archaeological record only hints at. The possibility that the expanded awareness induced by glacial conditions wasn't just individual, but collective. The remarkable consistency of Ice Age art and artifacts across different regions suggests that the altered states weren't just personal experiences, but shared consciousness phenomena that connected groups across vast distances. Modern research into collective consciousness suggests that under certain conditions, individual minds can become synchronized in ways that allow direct sharing of information and experience. The extreme conditions of the Ice Age, the small group sizes, the intense interdependence, the shared survival challenges might have naturally fostered such collective consciousness states, creating networks of shared awareness that spanned continents. This would explain how complex knowledge systems could be maintained and transmitted across thousands of years without writing, how astronomical observations could be coordinated across different locations, how similar artistic styles and symbolic systems could appear simultaneously in widely separated regions. The Ice Age peoples might have been connected not just by migration routes and trade networks, but by shared consciousness states that allowed direct transmission of knowledge and experience. The implications are profound. If Ice Age consciousness included capabilities for direct perception of natural patterns and collective sharing of information, then our ancestors possessed forms of awareness that we've largely lost in the modern world. The development of agriculture, writing, and large-scale civilization might have enhanced our technological capabilities, but at the cost of the consciousness expansion technologies that were essential for survival during the Ice Age. But the knowledge might not be entirely lost. The shamanic traditions that still exist in remote regions of the world preserve techniques for consciousness expansion that might be direct descendants of Ice Age practices. The meditation traditions of Asia maintain methods for accessing non-ordinary states of awareness that show remarkable similarities to the consciousness alterations described in Ice Age art and artifacts. The mystical traditions of various cultures speak of forms of direct perception and collective consciousness that match the capabilities suggested by Ice Age archaeological evidence. What if the real legacy of the Ice Age isn't just in our genes and our myths, but in our consciousness itself? What if the expanded awareness that allowed our ancestors to survive the Great Cooling is still available to us, waiting to be reactivated through appropriate practices and conditions? What if the challenges we face in the modern world, climate change, social fragmentation, the need to develop sustainable relationships with natural systems, require us to rediscover the consciousness technologies that served our ancestors so well during their long journey through the frozen world? The ice remembers, even if we have forgotten. In the deep structure of our nervous systems, in the quantum processes that underlie awareness, in the collective unconscious that connects all human minds, the patterns of Ice Age consciousness might still be preserved, waiting for us to create the conditions that will allow them to emerge once again into active use. The eternal return, every 100,000 years, like clockwork, the ice returns. The orbital cycles that govern Earth's relationship with the Sun, the eccentricity of our orbit, the tilt of our axis, the wobble of our rotation, combine in predictable patterns that bring periods of cooling so severe that mile-high glaciers once again march across the northern continents. We are currently living in what glaciologists call an interglacial period, a brief warm interval between ice ages that typically lasts 10,000 to 20,000 years before the cold returns. Our current interglacial began roughly 11,700 years ago, which means we may be approaching its natural end. The next ice age could begin at any time, tomorrow, in 1,000 years, in 10,000 years. When it comes, it will transform our world as completely as the last ice age transformed the world of our ancestors. The question isn't whether this will happen, but how our descendants will adapt when it does. But there's a deeper pattern at work here, one that goes beyond the simple mechanics of orbital cycles and climate change. The myths and legends of cultures around the world speak of cyclical time, of great ages that rise and fall in endless repetition, of civilizations that reach heights of knowledge and achievement only to be swept away by cosmic forces that reset the stage for new cycles of development. Could these myths be more than just metaphorical descriptions of historical change? Could they be cultural memories of actual cyclical processes that govern not just climate, but the entire trajectory of human civilization? The Hindu concept of cosmic cycles describes time as moving through vast periods called yugas, ages that span hundreds of thousands of years and follow predictable patterns of rise and decline. According to these traditions, we're currently living in the Kali Yuga, the dark age characterized by spiritual ignorance, material obsession, and the loss of our ancient wisdom. But this age will eventually end, and a new golden age will begin, bringing the return of the knowledge and capabilities that were lost during the dark period. The timing of these cycles corresponds remarkably well to the patterns of glacial advance and retreat. The Kali Yuga is said to last 432,000 years, which matches almost exactly the period of the major orbital cycles that control Ice Age timing. The descriptions of the Golden Age that preceded our current dark period, a time when humans possessed advanced knowledge of natural forces, when civilization existed in harmony with cosmic patterns, when the boundaries between physical and spiritual reality were understood and navigated with ease, match remarkably with the capabilities attributed to Ice Age cultures in the Wisdom Keeper myths. Similar cyclical concepts appear in other traditions. The Maya developed elaborate calendrical systems that tracked multiple overlapping cycles, from the short cycles of days and months to vast cycles spanning millions of years. Their long count calendar, which completed a major cycle on December 21, 2012, was part of a larger system that described the rise and fall of successive worlds, each destroyed and renewed according to cosmic patterns that operated on scales far beyond human lifespans. The Norse concept of Ragnarok describes the cyclical destruction and renewal of the world, with each cycle ending in a great winter that lasts for years, followed by floods that reshape the earth, and then the emergence of a new world populated by survivors who carry the essential knowledge forward into the next age. The Celtic traditions speak of similar cycles, with druids preserving sacred knowledge through periods of darkness and catastrophe, maintaining the continuity of wisdom through transitions from one world to another. These aren't just abstract mythological concepts. They represent sophisticated understanding of deep time, of the vast scales on which cosmic processes operate, of the cyclical nature of change itself. The people who developed these concepts understood that human civilization doesn't develop in a simple, linear progression from primitive to advanced, but moves through cycles of expansion and contraction, knowledge and ignorance, integration and fragmentation. Modern science is beginning to validate this cyclical view of history. Paleoclimatology shows that climate change operates on multiple overlapping cycles, from short-term variations lasting decades to vast cycles spanning millions of years. Each cycle creates different conditions for life on Earth, favouring different types of adaptation and selecting for different characteristics in surviving species. The Ice Ages represent just one type of cyclical change, part of a larger pattern of environmental fluctuation that has been shaping life on Earth for billions of years. But there's growing evidence that these environmental cycles don't just affect biological evolution. They also influence the development of consciousness and culture. in ways that create predictable patterns of civilizational rise and decline. The archaeological record shows evidence of advanced cultures appearing and disappearing throughout human history, often coinciding with major climate transitions. The end of the last ice age saw the sudden emergence of sophisticated civilizations around the world, as if the climate transition had triggered the release of previously dormant knowledge and capabilities. Could this pattern repeat with each major climate cycle? Could the approach of the next ice age trigger another flowering of human consciousness and culture as our descendants rediscover the adaptations that allowed our ancestors to survive the last glacial period? The possibility is both exciting and terrifying, suggesting that humanity's future might not depend on linear technological progress, but on our ability to remember and reactivate the cyclical wisdom that has carried our species through previous transitions. The evidence for this cyclical pattern isn't just in the ancient myths and archaeological record. It appears to be operating in the modern world as well, manifesting in the growing interest in traditional knowledge systems, the revival of shamanic and mystical practices, the search for sustainable technologies that work with natural cycles rather than against them. As environmental pressures increase and the limitations of linear progress become apparent, more and more people are turning to the cyclical wisdom traditions for guidance. The climate crisis itself might be triggering this return to cyclical thinking. As we face the possibility of dramatic environmental change on a scale not seen since the end of the last ice age, we're being forced to think in longer timeframes, to consider the deeper patterns that govern planetary systems, to develop adaptive strategies that can function across multiple generations. The linear thinking that characterized the industrial age, the assumption that progress means constant growth and increasing consumption of resources, is proving inadequate for dealing with cyclical environmental processes. But the return to cyclical wisdom isn't just about practical adaptation to environmental change. It's about recovering forms of consciousness and culture that were developed during previous cycles and that remain encoded in our collective memory. The shamanic practices that allowed Ice Age peoples to access expanded forms of awareness are being rediscovered and adapted for modern conditions. The astronomical knowledge that enabled ancient cultures to track cosmic cycles with remarkable precision is being integrated with modern scientific understanding. The sustainable technologies that allowed traditional cultures to thrive for thousands of years without depleting their resource base are being studied and modernized. This isn't just nostalgic romanticism about the past. It's recognition that the challenges we face in the modern world, climate change, resource depletion, social fragmentation, the search for meaning and purpose in an increasingly complex world, are the same challenges that human cultures have faced repeatedly throughout history. The solutions developed during previous cycles might be exactly what we need to navigate the current transition successfully. The Ice Age cycles represent the most dramatic of these recurring challenges, the ultimate test of human adaptability and wisdom. Our ancestors who survived the last glacial period didn't just endure harsh environmental conditions. They transformed those conditions into opportunities for consciousness, expansion, cultural development, and the preservation of essential knowledge. They learned to work with cyclical processes rather than fighting against them, to find stability in change itself, to maintain continuity of purpose across vast scales of space and time. As we approach the next potential Ice Age cycle, we have the opportunity to apply these same principles to our current situation. Instead of seeing climate change as an unprecedented catastrophe that threatens to destroy civilization, we can recognize it as part of a natural cyclical process that has been operating for millions of years. and that represents not just challenge but opportunity. The same environmental pressures that forced our ancestors to develop expanded consciousness and sophisticated adaptation strategies are now operating in our own time, selecting for the same qualities of flexibility, cooperation, and deep wisdom. The question is whether we'll recognize the opportunity and respond appropriately. Will we panic and try to fight against the natural cycles, exhausting ourselves in futile attempts to maintain unsustainable systems? Or will we remember the cyclical wisdom of our ancestors and use the current transition as a catalyst for consciousness expansion and cultural transformation? The myths suggest that this choice has been faced repeatedly throughout human history, and that the outcome determines not just immediate survival, but the trajectory of development for thousands of years to come. Cultures that recognize and work with the cyclical patterns develop forms of knowledge and capability that allow them to thrive during both the challenging and the favorable phases of the cycles. Cultures that resist the patterns and try to maintain linear progress through cyclical changes exhaust themselves and eventually collapse, losing much of their accumulated knowledge and capability in the process. The Ice Age cycles represent the deepest and most powerful of these patterns, the ultimate test of human wisdom and adaptability. Our ancestors who survived the last Ice Age didn't just endure, they were transformed, developing capabilities that enabled them to establish the foundations of post-glacial civilization. The next Ice Age cycle, whenever it comes, will present the same opportunity for transformation, the same potential for consciousness expansion and cultural evolution. But we don't have to wait for the ice to return to begin applying these principles. The cyclical patterns operate on multiple scales simultaneously, from the daily cycles of light and darkness to the vast cosmic cycles that span millions of years. By learning to recognize and work with the cycles that are already operating in our lives, seasonal cycles, economic cycles, life cycles, generational cycles, we can develop the skills and understanding needed to navigate the larger transitions that lie ahead. The eternal return isn't just about repetition, it's about spiral development, each cycle building on the knowledge and capability developed during previous cycles while adapting to new conditions and challenges. The next Ice Age won't be exactly like the last one, just as our current interglacial period has been different from previous warm periods. But the fundamental patterns remain the same, and the wisdom developed during previous cycles remains relevant for navigating future transitions. The ice remembers, and so do we, if we learn to access the deeper layers of memory that connect us to our cyclical heritage. In our genes, in our myths, in our capacity for consciousness expansion and cultural adaptation, we carry the accumulated wisdom of all the cycles our species has survived. The challenge is to remember this wisdom before we need it, to prepare for the next transition by understanding the patterns that govern all transitions. The future memory. In the quantum physics laboratories of the 21st century, researchers have discovered something that would have seemed impossible just decades ago. Information can flow backward through time. Quantum entanglement allows particles to maintain instantaneous connections across vast distances, and some interpretations suggest these connections might extend across time as well, creating correlations between past and future events that challenge our basic assumptions about causality and temporal flow. But perhaps this discovery shouldn't surprise us. Indigenous cultures around the world have always spoken of time as circular rather than linear, of past and future as different perspectives on the same eternal present, of knowledge that comes not from the past but from the future, memories of what has not yet occurred but somehow always was. could the consciousness expanding experiences of our Ice Age ancestors have included access to information from their own future, glimpses of what their descendants would discover, achieve, and become? The archaeological evidence suggests possibilities that stretch the boundaries of conventional understanding. The mathematical constants found in Ice Age art and architecture, pi, phi, the square root of 2, wouldn't be discovered by mainstream mathematics for tens of thousands of years. The astronomical knowledge encoded in megalithic structures required understanding of celestial mechanics that wouldn't be developed by academic astronomy until the modern era. The medical knowledge demonstrated by successful Ice Age surgical procedures included understanding of neuroanatomy that contemporary medicine is still struggling to master. How did Ice Age peoples possess knowledge that their linear descendants wouldn't redevelop for millennia? The conventional explanation focuses on the loss of knowledge during the transition from Ice Age to post-glacial civilization. The idea that sophisticated understanding was developed during the glacial period and then forgotten as human populations dispersed and adapted to new environmental conditions. But this explanation requires us to believe that Ice Age cultures developed advanced mathematics, astronomy, and medicine entirely through trial and error, without the accumulated written records and institutional structures that supposedly made such developments possible in later civilizations. The shamanic traditions offer a different explanation, one that involves consciousness accessing information across time as well as space. In shamanic understanding, time isn't a river flowing in one direction, but an ocean in which past, present, and future exist simultaneously. Consciousness, freed from the constraints of ordinary awareness through ritual practices and altered states, can navigate this ocean in any direction, accessing information from what we call the future as easily as from what we call the past. Modern physics is beginning to suggest that this shamanic understanding might be more than metaphor. The Wheeler-DeWitt equation, which attempts to describe the quantum state of the entire universe, contains no time variable at all, suggesting that time itself might be an emergent property of consciousness, rather than a fundamental feature of reality. If consciousness creates the experience of temporal flow, then expanded consciousness might be able to experience time differently, accessing information from across the entire temporal spectrum. This possibility helps explain some of the most puzzling aspects of Ice Age culture. The cave paintings at Chauvet and Lascaux don't just show remarkable artistic skill, they demonstrate knowledge of animal behaviour and anatomy that seems to come from intimate observation over extended periods. But the animals depicted include species that were already extinct or extremely rare in the regions where the art was created. How did the artists know what these animals looked like in life, how they moved, how they related to their environment? One possibility is that the artists were depicting not just memory of animals they had encountered, but future memory of what these animals had been like in even earlier periods, or what they would be like when rediscovered through paleontological reconstruction thousands of years in the future. The quantum nature of consciousness might have allowed Ice Age minds to access information across vast temporal distances, seeing the deep patterns that connect all manifestations of life across different time periods. The mathematical knowledge encoded in Ice Age artifacts suggests similar temporal accessibility. The sophisticated understanding of geometric relationships, astronomical cycles, and numerical constants that appears in the archaeological record wasn't developed through gradual accumulation of observations and calculations. It appears suddenly, fully formed, as if it were remembered rather than discovered. Could Ice Age consciousness have been accessing mathematical knowledge from future civilizations, seeing the deep patterns that would eventually be formalized through academic mathematics. The possibility becomes even more intriguing when we consider the cyclical nature of Ice Age patterns. If consciousness can access information across time, and if civilizational development follows cyclical patterns connected to environmental cycles, then Ice Age cultures might have been accessing not just their linear future, but their cyclical future. Knowledge from previous cycles of development that had achieved similar levels of understanding during earlier interglacial periods, or even from future cycles when humanity would once again develop advanced knowledge through different pathways. This interpretation would explain why Ice Age knowledge systems show such remarkable sophistication and internal consistency. If shamanic consciousness could access information from across multiple temporal cycles, then the knowledge, encoded in Ice Age art and architecture, wouldn't just represent the accumulated wisdom of a single glacial period, it would represent the distilled essence of human understanding developed across multiple cycles of civilizational rise and fall. The implications are staggering. If Ice Age peoples possessed forms of consciousness that could access future knowledge, then the cave paintings, megalithic structures, and symbolic systems of the glacial period might be more than just cultural artifacts. They might be messages from our ancestors to our future selves, encoding information that they knew would be needed during specific phases of the cyclical pattern. Consider the remarkable precision with which ancient monuments track astronomical cycles that span thousands of years. Stonehenge aligns not just with the annual movements of the sun and moon, but with the 18.6-year cycle of lunar standstills and the 26,000-year cycle of precession. The builders of these monuments couldn't have observed these longer cycles directly during their lifetimes, yet they encoded them with mathematical accuracy that wouldn't be matched by academic astronomy for millennia. How did they know? If consciousness can access information across time, then the monument builders might have been receiving knowledge from future astronomers who would eventually map these celestial cycles through careful observation and calculation. The monuments themselves might be preservation devices, designed to maintain essential astronomical knowledge through the dark periods when civilizational memory would be lost or fragmented. This perspective transforms our understanding of what the Ice Age wisdom keepers were actually doing. Instead of simply preserving knowledge from their own time, they might have been serving as temporal librarians, accessing information from across the entire span of human development and encoding it in forms that could survive the cyclical destructions and renewals that characterize Earth's history. The flood myths that appear in cultures around the world take on new significance from this perspective. Instead of just describing past catastrophes, they might be describing future events that the wisdom keepers perceived through their expanded consciousness. Warnings about climate transitions that would affect their descendants, instructions for surviving the periodic renewals that reshape human civilization. The Noah story, for example, isn't just about preserving life through a great flood. It's about preserving knowledge, maintaining the continuity of wisdom through a transition from one world to another. The Ark becomes a metaphor for consciousness itself, the vehicle that carries essential information across the temporal waters that separate different phases of the cyclical pattern. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this temporal perspective is what it suggests about our own time. If the Ice Age wisdom keepers were encoding messages for their future descendants, then some of those messages might be specifically intended for our current period, the end phase of the current interglacial, the time when humanity would once again need to prepare for major environmental transitions. Recent discoveries in archaeology and genetics seem to support this possibility. DNA analysis has revealed that modern humans carry genetic markers from multiple, archaic populations that should have gone extinct tens of thousands of years ago. These aren't just random genetic remnants. They appear to be specifically preserved sequences that encode information about adaptation to extreme environmental conditions. Could these genetic messages be part of the biological preservation system established by the Ice Age wisdom keepers? Similarly, the decoding of ancient symbolic systems is revealing levels of mathematical and astronomical sophistication that seem tailored for rediscovery at precisely this point in technological development. The mathematical constants encoded in the Great Pyramid, the astronomical alignments of Angkor Wat, the geometric patterns of Native American medicine wheels, all of these become fully comprehensible only when analysed with modern scientific instruments and theoretical frameworks. It's as if our ancestors designed these monuments to reveal their secrets gradually, providing different levels of information as human knowledge and technology developed. The basic structures could be appreciated and used by any civilization that encountered them, but the deeper encoded information would only become accessible when humanity had developed the scientific sophistication necessary to understand and apply it. This graduated revelation system would make perfect sense if the monument builders possessed consciousness that could access information about future technological development. They would know exactly what level of scientific understanding would be available at different points in the future, and they could encode their messages accordingly, ensuring that each generation would receive exactly the information it was capable of understanding and using. But the most important messages might be reserved for our current time, the period when humanity would face the same kind of environmental transitions that the Ice Age peoples navigated so successfully. The consciousness-expanding techniques that allowed our ancestors to access temporal information, the social organization systems that maintained knowledge continuity across generations, the sustainable technologies that worked in harmony with natural cycles. All of this wisdom might be encoded in the monuments and myths that surround us, waiting for us to develop the understanding necessary to decode and apply it. The shamanic traditions that still exist around the world might be the living remnants of this knowledge preservation system. Instead of primitive religious practices, they might be sophisticated technologies for accessing the temporal information networks established during the Ice Age. The plant medicines used in shamanic ceremonies, the ritual practices that induce altered states of consciousness, the mythological narratives that encode practical knowledge, all of these might be direct descendants of the techniques used by the Ice Age wisdom keepers to access future memory. Modern research into psychedelic experiences is beginning to reveal that these altered states consistently produce encounters with what subjects describe as non-human intelligences that possess advanced knowledge about natural processes, healing techniques, and the structure of reality itself. Participants often report receiving specific information about upcoming environmental changes, social transformations, and technological developments that later proved to be remarkably accurate. Could these experiences be accessing the same temporal information networks that the Ice Age shamans used to encode their messages? Could the plant spirits and machine elves encountered during psychedelic experiences actually be future echoes of the consciousness expansion techniques developed during the glacial period? The implications extend far beyond academic curiosity. If our Ice Age ancestors possessed consciousness technologies that allowed them to access information across time, and if they used these technologies to encode guidance for their descendants, then we might have access to survival instructions specifically designed for our current environmental crisis. The knowledge needed to navigate the transition from industrial civilization to sustainable post-carbon society might already exist, encoded in the monuments, myths, and shamanic practices that we've inherited from the glacial period. But accessing this knowledge would require us to develop the same consciousness expansion capabilities that our ancestors possessed. We would need to learn the techniques for altering awareness in ways that allow access to temporal information networks. We would need to recreate the social and cultural conditions that support such expanded consciousness. We would need to overcome the modern bias toward linear thinking and external technology, and redevelop the internal technologies that allow direct access to natural information systems. The Ice Age didn't just shape our bodies and our environment, it shaped the entire trajectory of human consciousness development, establishing patterns and capabilities that extend far beyond the glacial period itself. The expanded awareness that allowed our ancestors to survive the Great Cooling might be the same expanded awareness that we need to navigate the environmental and social challenges of the 21st century. But there's an even deeper pattern at work here, one that connects the Ice Age experience to the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. The quantum physics research that reveals the temporal non-locality of information suggests that consciousness might not be produced by the brain, but might be a fundamental feature of reality that the brain learns to access under certain conditions. If consciousness is indeed non-local in space and time, then the expanded awareness experienced during the Ice Age wouldn't just be a temporary adaptation to harsh environmental conditions. It would be a glimpse of the true nature of human awareness, a window into capabilities that represent our species' actual potential, rather than just emergency survival responses. The Ice Age might have been humanity's introduction to its own consciousness, the first time that environmental pressures were severe enough to force the development of awareness technologies that reveal the true scope of human mental capabilities. The shamanic traditions, the astronomical knowledge, the artistic sophistication, the social organization systems, all of these might be expressions of consciousness operating at its full potential, rather than the limited awareness that characterizes most human experience. From this perspective, the return of Ice Age conditions wouldn't just be an environmental challenge, it would be an opportunity for consciousness evolution, a chance for humanity to rediscover and further develop the awareness capabilities that were first awakened during the glacial period. The climate crisis that seems so threatening from a linear perspective might actually be the trigger for the next phase of human consciousness development. The environmental pressure that will force us to redevelop the expanded awareness technologies that our ancestors pioneered. The future memory encoded by the Ice Age wisdom keepers might include not just survival instructions but consciousness development protocols, specific techniques and practices designed to help their descendants navigate the transition from limited to expanded awareness. The monuments and myths might be more than preservation devices. They might be activation systems designed to trigger consciousness expansion when humanity reaches the appropriate stage of development. If this interpretation is correct, then the Ice Age legacy isn't just in our past, it's in our future as well. The consciousness technologies developed during the glacial period might represent the next stage of human evolution, capabilities that we're destined to redevelop as we face environmental challenges that require the same kind of expanded awareness that our ancestors pioneered. The ice remembers, and through the ice, we remember who we really are and what we're truly capable of becoming. The greatest discovery of the Ice Age might not have been fire or tools or language. It might have been consciousness itself. the recognition that human awareness has capabilities that transcend the ordinary limitations of space and time, and that discovery, encoded in the deep structures of our minds and the persistent patterns of our myths, continues to call us toward our own transformation, our own awakening to the full potential that lies dormant within the human species. The story of how the Ice Age shaped humanity isn't finished. It's still being written, still unfolding through the choices we make and the consciousness we develop as we face our own version of the great cooling and the great transformation that lies beyond it. The Awakening Protocol. Deep beneath the Greenland ice sheet, in cores that preserve atmospheric samples from the height of the last glaciation, scientists have discovered something unexpected. Traces of complex organic compounds that shouldn't exist in ice that's been frozen for 20,000 years. These molecules show signs of deliberate synthesis, suggesting the presence of advanced biochemical processes during the depths of the Ice Age. But perhaps more mysteriously, the compounds appear to be designed to remain stable across vast periods of time, as if they were intended to survive until the ice began to melt and release them into the modern environment. Could these molecular time capsules be more than just chemical curiosities? Could they represent a biological preservation system established by Ice Age peoples who understood that their descendants would eventually need access to the knowledge and capabilities that had been developed during the glacial period? The compounds show remarkable similarities to the psychoactive substances used in shamanic practices around the world, molecules that alter consciousness in ways that seem specifically designed to enhance pattern recognition, expand temporal awareness, and facilitate access to non-ordinary states of perception. The timing of their release into the environment corresponds almost exactly with the period when human civilization began showing renewed interest in consciousness expansion, shamanic practices, and alternative approaches to understanding reality. The psychedelic renaissance of the 1960s, the New Age movement of the 1980s, the current resurgence of interest in plant medicines and meditation practices, all of these cultural phenomena coincide with the accelerating release of these ancient compounds as glacial ice melts and permafrost thaws around the world. But the molecular preservation system might be just one component of a larger awakening protocol established by the Ice Age wisdom keepers. Archaeological sites around the world are revealing new layers of complexity as modern analytical techniques allow researchers to detect previously invisible features and patterns. Stone circles that appeared to be simple ceremonial sites are showing evidence of sophisticated acoustic engineering designed to induce specific brainwave states. Cave paintings that seemed purely artistic are revealing encoded information that becomes comprehensible only when analyzed with fractal mathematics and quantum field theory. The Great Pyramid of Giza provides perhaps the most dramatic example of this graduated revelation system. For centuries, the pyramid was understood simply as a pharaoh's tomb, impressive for its size and precision, but essentially just an elaborate burial chamber. But as measurement techniques became more sophisticated, researchers began discovering that the pyramid's dimensions encode mathematical constants with extraordinary precision. Pi, phi, the speed of light, the mass of the Earth, the distance to the Sun. More recently, advanced scanning techniques have revealed hidden chambers within the pyramid that appear to be designed as resonance chambers, spaces where specific sound frequencies would create standing wave patterns that could alter consciousness in predictable ways. The pyramid begins to look less like a tomb and more like a consciousness technology, a device designed to induce expanded awareness states in individuals who possessed the knowledge to operate it properly. But perhaps the most intriguing discovery is that the pyramid's internal chambers seem to be designed to activate in sequence, as if the structure contains a programmed awakening protocol that would reveal different levels of knowledge as humanity developed the sophistication to access them. The initial chambers, accessible through conventional archaeology, contain relatively straightforward mathematical and astronomical information. But the deeper chambers, accessible only through advanced scanning techniques, appear to contain information about consciousness itself, the structure of awareness, the techniques for expanding perception, the methods for accessing temporal information networks. The pattern repeats at sites around the world: Stonehenge, Angkor Wat, Chichen Itza, Easter Island. All of these monuments show evidence of multi-layered information encoding systems that reveal new dimensions of complexity as our analytical capabilities advance. It's as if the builders designed these structures to serve as interactive textbooks, providing exactly the level of information that each generation would be capable of understanding and applying. But the awakening protocol extends beyond individual monuments to encompass entire landscapes and regions. Recent research using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar has revealed that many ancient sites are connected by precise geometric relationships that span continents. The monuments aren't isolated structures, but components in a global network of consciousness enhancement facilities, positioned according to mathematical principles that take into account the Earth's magnetic field, gravitational anomalies, and geological resonance patterns. This global network appears to be designed to activate in phases as humanity develops the technological and consciousness capabilities necessary to perceive and interact with increasingly complex levels of the system. The first phase, accessible through basic archaeological techniques, reveals individual monuments and their local astronomical alignments. The second phase, accessible through advanced measurement and analysis, reveals the mathematical relationships between different sites and the encoded information they contain. The third phase, which we're only beginning to access through satellite technology and global positioning systems, reveals the planetary scale patterns that connect all the sites into a single integrated system. What might the fourth and fifth phases reveal? If the pattern continues, they would involve levels of analysis and interaction that we haven't yet developed, perhaps requiring consciousness expansion technologies that allow direct interface with the monument network, or perhaps involving capabilities that emerge only when human awareness reaches certain thresholds of development. The shamanic traditions suggest that such capabilities already exist, waiting to be reactivated through appropriate practices and conditions. The plant medicine traditions of the Amazon speak of plant teachers that provide specific information about healing, astronomy, and the structure of reality. But these traditions also speak of plant spirits that are connected to global information networks, consciousness entities that can access knowledge from anywhere on the planet and from any point in time. Could these plant teachers be biological components of the awakening protocol established during the Ice Age? Could the psychoactive compounds found in traditional medicines be designed to interface with the consciousness technologies encoded in the ancient monument network? The geographic distribution of psychoactive plants shows remarkable correspondence with the locations of major archaeological sites, suggesting that the botanical and architectural components of the system were designed to work together. The ayahuasca traditions of South America provide a particularly intriguing example. The ayahuasca brew combines plants containing DMT, a powerful consciousness-altering compound, with plants containing MAO inhibitors that allow the DMT to remain active when taken orally. The specific combination shouldn't work according to conventional pharmacology, yet indigenous people somehow discovered this exact recipe thousands of years ago. But the mystery deepens when we consider that the ayahuasca experience consistently produces encounters with intelligence entities that provide specific information about plant medicines, healing techniques, and ecological relationships. Participants often report receiving detailed instructions for treating diseases they've never encountered, or gaining sudden understanding of complex scientific concepts that they had no previous knowledge of. How is this possible? The shamanic explanation is that the ayahuasca compounds allow consciousness to access the same temporal information networks that the Ice Age wisdom keepers used to encode their knowledge. The plant spirits encountered during the experience aren't separate entities, but aspects of the expanded awareness that becomes accessible when normal consciousness limitations are temporarily dissolved. Modern research into psychedelic experiences is beginning to support this interpretation. Brain imaging studies show that psychoactive compounds don't add new information to the mind. Instead, they remove the neural filters that normally limit conscious access to information processing systems. The experiences of expanded awareness, temporal accessibility, and encounter with non-human intelligence might represent temporary access to cognitive capabilities that exist continuously but remain unconscious under normal conditions. If this is correct, then the psychoactive compounds found in traditional medicines might be designed to provide controlled, temporary access to the expanded consciousness states that the Ice Age peoples learned to maintain continuously. The plant medicine traditions might be training systems designed to gradually expand human awareness capabilities until individuals can access the advanced consciousness states without external assistance. But the awakening protocol might involve more than just individual consciousness expansion. The Global Monument Network appears to be designed to facilitate collective consciousness phenomena, creating conditions where expanded awareness states can be shared across multiple individuals simultaneously. The acoustic properties of sites like Stonehenge and the Temple of Kukulkan suggest that they were designed to synchronize brainwave patterns across groups of people, creating shared consciousness experiences that would allow direct transmission of knowledge and awareness. These collective consciousness capabilities might represent the ultimate phase of the awakening protocol, the point at which humanity redevelops the group awareness states that characterized Ice Age culture. Instead of isolated individuals struggling to maintain expanded consciousness in a culture that doesn't support such states, we might be approaching a threshold where collective consciousness becomes the normal mode of human awareness, supported by both biological and technological systems that facilitate shared perception and understanding. The implications are staggering. If the Ice Age wisdom keepers established a global system designed to reactivate advanced consciousness capabilities at precisely this point in human development, then we might be living through the most significant transformation in human history since the original glacial awakening. The environmental crises, social upheavals, and consciousness revolution of the modern era might all be components of a carefully orchestrated awakening process, designed to force humanity to redevelop the awareness capabilities that will be necessary for navigating the next phase of planetary evolution. The ice is melting, the monuments are revealing their secrets, the plant medicines are spreading beyond their traditional boundaries, and human consciousness is showing signs of rapid expansion. The awakening protocol established by our Ice Age ancestors might finally be reaching its culmination, preparing humanity for a return to the expanded awareness states that characterized our species during its most successful period of environmental adaptation. But the awakening isn't automatic. It requires conscious participation, deliberate engagement with the consciousness technologies that our ancestors preserved for us. The monuments must be studied, the plant medicines must be approached with respect and understanding, the shamanic practices must be learned and integrated into modern life. The Ice Age wisdom keepers provided the tools, but we must learn to use them. The question is whether we'll recognize the opportunity and respond appropriately. Will we dismiss the awakening protocol as primitive superstition and continue trying to solve modern problems with the limited consciousness that created them? Or will we embrace our Ice Age heritage and use the crisis of our time as a catalyst for rediscovering the expanded awareness that represents humanity's true potential? The ice remembers, the stones remember, the plants remember, and deep within our own consciousness, beyond the filters of modern conditioning, we remember too. The awakening protocol isn't just about recovering ancient knowledge. It's about remembering who we really are and what we're capable of becoming when consciousness operates at its full potential.